In the previous installment of Nomifactory, I found a profound way of obtaining infinite tungsten, allowing me to obtain the Tier 4 micro miner, allowing me to obtain the Tier 5 micro miner, allowing me to obtain the first science fiction tier material of all time, Naquadah, which will be needed for all future technology. But due to how rare Naquadah is, I concluded that I must first recreate an entire factory dedicated to extracting the most Naquadah ontologically possible from this ore. But little did I know about the vertiginous mountain of tasks I would need to do, just to make my factory slightly more efficient. And it all begins with my scheduled visit to the moon, for my regular industrious exploitation of its natural resources. This time, the resource I was seeking is known as tantalite, the source of a brand new element I was about to discover, tantalum. Apparently, when this is mixed with other elements, I could invent and smelt tantalum carbide, which will be the first of many industrial-sounding alloys, such as high-speed steel type G, titanium carbide, molybdenum disilicide, and other notable mentions. The reason why I needed all these industrial-sounding materials is that they were needed to construct the alloy blast smelter, not to be confused with the blast furnace. So far, all I had done with the blast furnace was smelt one material into one ingot material. But the alloy blast smelter takes several disparate materials and turns them into a boiling hot soup of specialty materials, which can be solidified into the same ingots. Not only could this be used to skip having to mix alloys before smelting them, but this would be needed to acquire higher tier industrial sounding alloys with names such as Inkalloy M956, Ziran 100, and Maceration Steel 300. These were too complicated to make with just a simple mixer and blast furnace, and I needed all of them to begin my descent into graduality multi-blocks. But why would I need such a preposterous thing? So far, most of my industrial tasks were carried out by single-block machines, with a few exceptions here and there. But for each type of single-block machine, there was a multi-block version, which was bigger, better, faster, stronger, and parallelized. The ore crushing machine could be replaced by the maceration tower. The ore washing machine could be replaced by the large chemical bath, and every other step in my ore processing area could be switched out with the large centrifuge unit, large sifter, and large packaging machine. This would make ore processing tens of times more efficient, and I could finally process the Naquadah from the previous episode. And all this starts with me getting the alloys for the alloy blast smelter. After mixing together everything I needed, I made the executive decision to upgrade all of my blast furnaces to ludicrous voltage tier. This would be done by firing all of the old extreme energy hatches, fabricating some new insane energy hatches, and gluing them back into the furnace. With their revived zeal and enthusiasm for smelting, the furnaces then proceeded to nearly instantaneously smelt everything I needed. Now that the alloys were smelted, it was time to make the smelter from the alloys. The first components to craft were the heat-proof blast smelting casings, made from HSLA steel, titanium carbide, and tungsten carbide. The heat vents, from tantalum carbide and titanium and molybdenum disilicide. The high-speed steel type G coils, from the metal that is referred to in its name, plus some tungsten steel and tungsten. And finally, the blast smelter controller itself, made from some insane voltage machinery. Now it was time to birth the entire blast smelter into our plane of existence. The smelter shall be put in the smelting quadrant of the resource processing floor, on this new insane voltage power grid. After plugging in the smelter using two energy hatches, it was time to have a major realization that I also needed a vacuum freezer to solidify all of the molten outputs made by the smelter. So I did a quick detour to transform several tins of spare aluminum into vacuum freezer parts, which I then summoned next to the blast smelter. Theoretically, this should work. Now it was time to test if it actually worked. The first test shall commence, with my attempt at synthesizing the Ziran 100 superalloy, from iron, nickel, tungsten, niobium, and cobalt. This attempt was met by the blast smelter undergoing a nuclear brightness change, which meant that it was working. After about a minute or 2 minutes, molten Ziran is created, which is pumped into the vacuum freezer, which contains an ingot mold, to create the solid Ziran ingot. This was the outer material for 20% of the maceration tower, but I was slowly getting there. According to my calculations, since we needed 2 maceration towers for ore processing, and since we need this amount of blue casings per tower, and since each blue casing consumes 6 Ziran, we would need a few hundred Ziran ingots, but this was no problem. I already had infinite tungsten from endstone anyways. The main concern were the massive amounts of insane voltage motors and ultimate ingots I needed for the crushing wheels of the tower. Ultimate, not to be confused with ultimate, is composed of cobalt, chrome, nickel, and molybdenum. I was concerned that I would have insufficient cobalt and molybdenum, but somehow, I saw that I had hundreds of these spare elements, and I don't know why. These were probably obtained from some ancient ore processing, or were byproducts that I did not even know existed during the past 13 episodes, but that was convenient. Once all the Ziran was done being amalgamated, I dumped in all of the ingredients to concoct some molten ultimate soup. So while that smelting task was in progress, I returned to Earth to do what my ancestors did. I mined even more graphite. But you may recall that I had already mined graphite a few episodes ago. It only took a few episodes to run out of this technology critical element. So I learned my lesson and mined even more graphite than the past version of myself, to ensure I did not have to return to mine manually for just 5 minutes. With the graphite, it was time to auto-craft several tens of insane voltage motors from my trusty matter energy system. After a bit more waiting, it appears that my Ziran and ultimate was now real, so it was time to move on to smelting tungsten carbide as well. The old way of obtaining tungsten carbide was to mix together tungsten and carbon before smelting it, but with the alloy blast smelter, I could simply skip the mixing step by simply putting tungsten and carbide in the smelter for molten tungsten carbide. And now, it was time to assemble together the bright blue maceration tower casings. I bent hundreds of Ziran and lathed hundreds of titanium, so I could build the casings. Next, I stuffed the ultimate and tungsten carbide into gear molds to obtain hundreds of especially hard gears, which I combined with some of the casings and the insane motors, to obtain the crushing wheels. Now for the final phase of the final act of the final part of this step, I created the maceration tower controller, which is simply an insane voltage gear macerator with a few extraneous items slapped on top of it. This was followed by 5 seconds of joy, and then I was pulled back to reality. The more I dug myself deeper into this ore processing rabbit hole, the more I realized that I was not prepared. The expenses of this project were getting out of hand in foot and head and body limbs. Every Gregicality multiblock is similar in one way: they needed parallelization hatches. But what does this even mean? The parallelization hatches allow the machines to run multiple processes at once, with higher tiers allowing for even more multitasking, all the way up to processing 256 items simultaneously. But for now, we could only afford the first tier, which was already ridiculously expensive. It consumed ludicrous tier circuits and insane voltage sensory equipment, which needed iridium. I already obtained those iridium ores from the tier 4 multiversal colonization in the previous episode, but I had made an agreement with myself to only process these ores once I had the upgraded ore processor to extract as many materials as impossibly possible, since these ores were extremely expensive. So for now, our only source of iridium was still sheldonite, which I had to mine extensively in the end. While this nightmarish contraption was extracting iridium from sheldonite, I would work on making the next multiblock in my ore processing upgrade, the large chemical bath, for washing ores. This would be made primarily of watertight steel, as well as some titanium pipe casings. But this was easy. I already had about 1,000 titanium, so all I had to do was to drag stuff into machines and do a bit of mindless clicking to get what I needed. And watertight steel was simply made from blasting some iron, aluminum, nickel, chrome, and sulfur, all of which I had thousands of. And soon enough, I had all the watertight steel I needed, which I bent into the necessary plates and frames I needed to glue together into watertight casings. I would also need the large chemical bath controller, but I decided that I would simply make all of the controllers I needed at once later on, since making the controllers one at a time was exhausting. And alloy, was made out of rather concerning materials. I needed manganese, aluminum, yttrium, and vanadium steel, which was made of steel, vanadium, and chrome. I had all of those elements, except for yttrium. Most of the yttrium of the old days was annihilated to make yttrium barium QRT superconductors. So the solution was to process as much redstone ore as possible with the old ore processor, to squeeze all of the rare earth for yttrium. And after mixing together some vanadium steel, I might as well smelt as much alloy as I could right now, so that I did not have to deal with it later on. The other half of the alloy demands would be dealt with once I actually had the adequate amount of yttrium. In the meantime, I threw some tungsten and iridium in the normal blast furnace to convert them into ingot form, which were needed for the 5 parallelization hatches I needed, and 5 times 4 means I needed 20 quantum supercomputers. My reaction was holy guacamole, but I had seen this coming. Back when I invented quantum circuits, I had already made auto-crafting patterns to assemble the quantum supercomputers, and the only thing I was missing were a bunch of RAM chips, which were some of the cheapest electronic chips to make anyways. Once that was done, I set the supercomputer crafting into motion, and I turned my attention towards smelting the final batch of alloy MA956 I needed, since I had processed all the yttrium I needed in the meantime. While I waited for alloy, I proceeded to create the blocks for the final multi-block I needed for ore processing, the large packaging machine, for turning all of the tiny and small dust byproducts into usable large dusts, for common use. Luckily, this did not need any fancy shenanigans. It only needed solid steel casings, much to the relief of the entire local group. So after I was done dealing with making all the steel casings for the large packaging trigonal trapezohedron, it appears that I had all the alloy I needed for the sifting funnel and centrifuge unit. So as usual, I stuffed them all into the metal bending machines and assembling machines to produce the vibration-safe casings. To go along with this, I needed a rather large amount of steel pipe casings, but this was no problem either. After this, it looks like my quantum supercomputers have all been born. So I combined this with some iridium, some tungsten, and some nether stars, to create the parallelization hatches. And last but not least, it was time to make the controllers for the ore washer, sifting funnel, packaging machine, and centrifuge. This was the most annoying part, because every single controller needed something different: pistons, robot arms, centrifuges, packagers, chemical baths, blah blah blah. After a comatose state of mindless crafting and demanding stuff from my matter energy system, it appears that I have actually done it. I had everything, and so, it seems that I have survived the ordeal of Grejicality multi-blocks. The moral of the story is that once I started something that would take a long time to process, it was a good idea to start another task that would take a long time, meaning that I would be making several expensive components at the same time, basically multi-single tasking, and due to this, I had made it through relatively unscathed. GregTech could not wear me down so easily. Now all I had to do was to tear out my old ore processing system, and begin the construction of my parallelized multi-block insane voltage ore processing. My original plans for the ore processing system was followed according to 5% of the plan. What I actually made was far beyond recognition, but I shall explain the functionality of this, and how it functions. First, the ores are fed into the first maceration tower, to create crushed ore, some mineral dust, and stone dust. The stone dust is erased from existence, and the mineral dust is escorted into this ender chest. Disclaimer: this setup uses about a quadrillion ender chests, each with a different color code. The different color codes correspond to different transportation channels. Any process that makes tiny dusts, will have tiny dusts transported into white red ender chests, which were all connected to the white ender chest, which feeds into the packaging machine. To deal with the 5 bajillion types of tiny dusts, I used humongous input hatches to ensure that the leftover unpackaged dusts would not clog up the entire machine. And any process that makes normal dusts, will have normal dusts transported into white ender chests, which were all connected to the white chest, which feeds into this massive wooden drawer storage wall of elements and minerals and materials. The packaging machine also feeds into this. It was the final destination of ore processing. Anyways, back to what I was talking about. The crushed ores from the first maceration tower are siphoned into the large chemical bath, with an infinite water source attached to infinitely wash the theoretically infinite amount of ores, to make washed ores and tiny dusts. The washed ores are then fed into the large centrifuge to make centrifuge doors and even more tiny dusts. And finally, the centrifuge doors are crushed in another tower to make a massive amount of mineral dusts, all connected to ender chests. There was one exception to this process, for ores containing gems, namely apatite and salt ores. They were filtered into the large sifting funnel that was standing menacingly above the chemical bath. This would create gems of several ratings, and some purified dust. But this purified dust is not dust. It has to be transported into the centrifuge to obtain dust and tiny dust, and the sifted gems were all sent to a pulverizer to make dust. All of this dust is also sent to the ender chest for long-term, or possibly infinitely long-term, storage. And all of this somehow works. It had amazing speed and productivity, which were basically the same thing. This ore processing line was also sponsored by automatic maintenance hatches, which I made simply from a few high-voltage parts that were moderately annoying to synthesize. These would make manual maintenance extinct. Gone were the days of having to maintain everything myself with a bunch of random tools, for approximately 5% of the base, because I was too lazy to upgrade all the other multiblocks to use this new feature. But after observing this ore processing for a bit, I noticed a devastating issue. The centrifuge was slightly slower than the rest of my machines, so it was getting clogged up very slowly. This was unacceptable. Luckily there were 3 main ways to speed this up. The first method is to make another centrifuge unit to run alongside the original unit, which I was too lazy to do. The second method is to increase the power intake of the centrifuge unit, which would not work because this power grid was already on the brink of being overloaded. The final method was to get the Tier 2 parallelization hatch, for quadruple the efficiency. And so, with a heavy heart, I announced to myself that I shall go for this new hatch, and my fate was sealed. I would need ludicrous tier sensory equipment, and quantum mainframes, which were somehow beyond quantum supercomputers. This would need palladium, niobium, titanium, samarium, HSSG, rhodium, palladium, lumium, even more quantum circuits, and the assembly line that I made about 2 episodes ago. After what felt like 10 minutes of assembling everything I needed, I assembled everything I needed. This surprisingly did not need 100 billion extra unforeseen steps. So I assembled the new hatch and used it to speed up the centrifuge. Now this ore processing chain was no longer bottlenecked at the centrifuge. Therefore it was now time to test the absolute limits of this system. You may have remembered several episodes ago that I had also sent a few Tier 1 missions into the microverse. Back then, I was focused on the ilmenite, but all of these missions gave a byproduct of dense iron ores, which could be decompressed into 16 iron ores using nitric acid. Fast forward to today, and I have about 6 Olympic swimming pools of the tasty nitric acid, so I retrieved all of the dense iron ores that had been piling up, and made a setup to decompress them once and for all. I sent the dense iron ores towards this extreme chemical reactor, and connected the matter energy system to it, so I could import my stored nitric acid. This began the dense iron decompression chemical reaction. So I sent all of the resulting iron ore to the ore processing chain, to extract all of its iron. But you may recall that everything from ore processing is simply in dust form. Most of the time, I needed materials in ingot form. So it was time to bring back the multi-smelter. In modern times, I only used this to smelt wrought iron for steel, but this could be upgraded. I consumed some tungsten steel to make some tungsten steel coils, and retrieved some extreme voltage energy hatches. These would be used to upgrade the temperature limit and voltage limit of the multi-smelter, which would result in a ridiculous speed boost, and the smelter would be moved next to the ore processing quadrant. The result was that even though it already smelted stuff instantly, it now smelted stuff instantly, but smelted more stuff at once instantly. As in, it was producing thousands of ingots at once. This was gaming, but I would spare some dusts in dust form, since I would need them in dust form for some industrial tasks, like mixing. With that out of the way, the ore processing system was truly completed. Now I could process the osmium iridium ores from the previous episode, to obtain an obscene amount of osmium and iridium. Far more than what was foretold by using the pathetic sheldonite. This meant that the Tier 5 Naquadah mining spaceship would also be at least 39% cheaper to make. And speaking of Naquadah, I could extract frankly ridiculous amounts of Naquadah that I had also obtained from the last episode. And now, I finally had Naquadah powder, and this Naquadah was a technology-critical element. Starting very soon, it would be needed in circuits, machines, fusion reactors, and blast furnace coils. Currently, the highest tier of coils I had were the HSSG thingies, which could only go up to 5400 Kelvin, but Naquadah supported up to 7200 Kelvin. Therefore, using the Naquadah coils would not only speed up lower temperature processes, but also unlock new processes that needed ridiculous amounts of temperature. Therefore, I wanted it. Therefore, I needed it. But first, I had to deal with something extremely annoying. The matter energy system is connected to the rest of the base using Fluix cables, and Fluix cables needed energized Certus wards. To obtain those, I needed to right-click them into chargers and right-click them again mindlessly, which took a few minutes per stack I needed, which felt like the Poincaré copyright recurrence time for the quantum state of a hypothetical box containing a black hole with the estimated mass of the entire universe, assuming Lind's chaotic inflationary model with an inflate in whose mass is a millionth of one Planck mass. Things had to change, and they just did, because I used a bit of spare stainless steel, monodust, and titanium, to create the energetic infuser, which was a much faster way to charge Certus wards. While all of this was happening, I had been smelting the infamous Signalum alloy. According to scientists and myself, Signalum was a much better electrical conductor than Lumium, and since the energy consumption of this base was exponentially increasing, I would need better electrical cables to prevent a disastrous, catastrophic, cataclysmic, apocalyptic power outage, which would be made by combining Lumium cables with wire-milled Signalum in an assembling machine. To replace the old Lumium cables, I used an ancient technique I learned from reading comments. It was called right-clicking. By simply right-clicking the Lumium cables, it would be replaced directly with the cables I had in my hand, without having to break the old cables. Now, it was time for the real deal, smelting Naquadah, so I could get the Naquadah coil. Just like every other high-tier material, smelting it causes it to be hot, which means it has to be cooled, but hot Naquadah can only be cooled using liquid helium. Luckily, this was not a very big detour. After ordering some aluminum casings and crafting a new vacuum freezer, I assembled the second freezer next to the first one and connected it to the power grid, and then I used the matter energy system to export helium from the air processing quadrant, straight into this freezer, which caused it to become frozen into liquefied helium. This will be dumped into the original freezer, and all of the smelted Naquadah will be dumped on top of the dumped helium in the freezer, which will dump cold Naquadah ingots. This left behind some unused normal helium, which will be sent straight back into the helium refrigerator. Anyways, I grabbed the Naquadah ingots, so I could feel a sense of achievement for 5 seconds. And as it turns out, this whole time, we have all been clickbaited, because Naquadah coils needed osmium and tungsten steel as well. The tungsten steel was easy, but the osmium was a slightly bigger problem. I already had hundreds of osmium from processing the osmiridium ore, but smelting it would cause a weighting incident. So in the meantime, I fed several hundred Naquadah ingots into the wire mill, and fed a few more osmium into the bending machines for foils, and stuffed tunks to assemble 42 Naquadah coils. But wait, A blast furnace only needed 16 coils, and 42 is not equal to 16 according to the logical axioms of formal mathematics. Well, I had a plan. I had come up with a genius blast furnace design, to quadruple efficiency, at a rather low cost. Using the magic of wall sharing, I could combine 4 blast furnaces using 64 coils, into this complex of 4 blast furnaces using 42 coils. Each corner was technically its own blast furnace. It was just that the coils were part of more than one blast furnace. So I simply recreated this design in my playthrough world, using a bit of extra inver casings, insane voltage energy hatches, and other hatches, and blast furnace controllers. On top of this whole thing, was a quadruple fluid input hatch, capable of holding 4 gases at once. This singular hatch was technically a part of all 4 blast furnaces, so each blast furnace technically contained all the gases contained in the same hatch, and the 4 gases would be nitrogen, argon, helium, and nothing. These 3 gases would be used to speed up smelting processes for any dust, no matter if it was aluminum, tungsten, or Naquadah. Next to the fluid hatch were 2 item input hatches, each of them feeding into 2 adjacent blast furnaces. It was in these 2 item hatches that dusts and other thingies would be fed, to be smelted. The outputs of all the smelting were put into the same singular output hatch. Any hot ingots would be sorted into the vacuum freezer, using an OR dictionary filter that detects if an item has the word hot in its name. Anything else would be sent straight to the matter energy system, since anything without hot in its name obviously did not have to be cooled. This was such a genius high IQ system. This was Minecraft smelting at its peak. I could use the Naquadah to smelt Naquadah but even faster, but all these machines and multi-blocks and materials I had obtained today would pale in comparison for the insanity that would soon follow in the quest for the fusion reactor. Because of polybenzimidazole, crystal computing, and other farcical challenges that I have been challenged to overcome, which I shall do in the next installment of Nomifactory.